My finger was on the trigger. 10 feet away, the monster that broke into my home waited for my judgment. My brain screamed, "Kill it!" But its eyes, there was nothing animal in them. I lowered the rifle, making a choice that led to the strangest friendship of my life, and to a betrayal so brutal, it silenced this forest forever. The morning ritual was the anchor of my life. The cold bite of the floorboards on my bare feet, the low hiss of the gas stove as I lit it for coffee, and the first pale light spilling over the jagged peaks of the Cascades. For 5 years, this had been my world, a quiet kingdom of pine and stone 40 miles from the nearest town. I'd come here to escape the noise, the endless hum of a life that had ceased to feel like my own. Out here, the only sounds were the ones that belonged. The cry of a hawk, and the rustle of a deer in the underbrush, and the groan of ancient trees in the wind. I'd finished my coffee, the bitter warmth of familiar comfort, and was pulling on my boots to go chop wood when I noticed it. The silence inside the cabin felt different. Not peaceful, but empty. On the small kitchen counter next to the sink was a space where the ceramic honey pot always sat. It was gone. I frowned, scanning the room. My mind, softened by solitude, could play tricks. Maybe I had moved it, but I had not. Then I saw the window above the sink was unlatched, swinging slightly in the breeze. I always locked it. Always. A cold dread, foreign and sharp, trickled down my spine. As I turned from the window, my eyes fell upon the floor. There, pressed into the worn pine planks, was a single, massive footprint, still damp with melted snow and mud. It was shaped like a man's, but it was nearly twice the size of my own boot. Paranoia is a weed that grows fast in the soil of isolation. I spent the next 2 days in a state of high alert, my old hunting rifle never far from my hand. The massive footprint on my floor was a violation, a question mark branded into the certainty of my world. After photographing it from every angle with my old film camera, I scrubbed it away, but I could not erase it from my mind. I took the rifle with me everywhere, even to the outhouse. I walked the perimeter of my clearing a dozen times, my boots sinking into the wet snow, searching for a trail, for any other sign. There was nothing. The snow was a blank canvas, undisturbed save for my own tracks and the delicate prints of a fox. It was as if the creature had descended from the sky and entered my cabin, only to vanish back into the ether. This lack of evidence was more maddening than finding a clear path. It made me question my own eyes. Had the snow melted and refrozen in a strange way? Had I brought in a clump of mud on my own boot that I'd somehow failed to notice? But I knew the truth. The print had been too large, too perfectly formed, too undeniably other. I reinforced the window latch with 2 new screws and hammered a heavy iron bar into place across the inside of the door at night. These were the actions of a sane, practical man. But they felt like a child's rituals against the dark. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague prickle on my neck. It was a constant, heavy pressure, as if the forest itself had developed eyes. The familiar woods, my sanctuary for 5 years, now felt alien and menacing. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper a little too clearly. The nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape, only a shallow, a fitful state of listening. I'd lie in bed, the rifle leaning against the nightstand, and strained to decipher the nocturnal symphony. I could no longer find comfort in the hoot of an owl or the distant yip of a coyote. Every sound was a potential threat. And then new sounds began. Sounds that the wind could not explain. Not howls or growls, but something more deliberate. On the second night, it started. Rhythmic knocks on wood, echoing from deep in the valley. 3 heavy thuds. A pause, then 2 more. It was a pattern, too intentional for falling branches, too resonant for a woodpecker. It sounded like a slow, patient conversation I could not comprehend. On the third night, the knocking was closer, and then a sound from much nearer shattered the quiet. A sharp crack, followed by the tinkle of breaking glass. It came from the old greenhouse attached to the back of the cabin, a dilapidated structure of wood and glass I used for storing tools and firewood. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden, ringing silence. For a long moment, I did not move, my body frozen, every nerve screaming. Then came a low grunt and the scraping sound of metal against concrete. Something was in there, something big. I grabbed the rifle and a flashlight, my hands slick with sweat. The floorboards were ice cold under my feet as I crept to the connecting door. I took a deep, shuddering breath, turned the knob, and pushed it open. I swept the beam of light into the darkness. The circle of light danced over overturned sacks of soil, shattered terracotta pots, and shards of glass that glittered like fallen stars in the dirt. My gaze followed the path of destruction to the far corner, where the beam landed on a huge, dark shape. It was hunched over, its massive back to me, trying to untangle its leg from a metal rack of old garden tools it had knocked over. It was clumsy, its movements hampered by pain and the awkward entanglement. It made a low, frustrated sound, a deep rumble of breath that was not a growl. My first thought, a desperate grasp at reason, was bear. A black bear woken from hibernation, starving and confused. But the shape was wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the torso too long, the limbs too proportional. As I watched, it finally wrenched its leg free with a pained grunt and turned its head toward the light. I froze. It was not a bear. It stood on 2 legs, stooped under the low ceiling, but still immense, a creature of impossible size covered in thick, dark brown fur. My flashlight beam trembled in my hand, catching the steam of its breath in the frigid air. The light played over a landscape of matted hair, caked with mud and what looked like pine needles. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, a solid wall of muscle that tapered down to a surprisingly narrow waist. The arms were enormous, hanging down nearly to its knees, and the hands, even balled into loose fists, were the size of dinner plates. This was not a bear. A bear's shape is one of brute, quadrupedal power. This creature was built differently, its proportions unnervingly, grotesquely, like those of a man. It was the face, however, that stopped my breath and froze the blood in my veins. It was not the face of an animal. The beam slid up from its massive chest, and for a heart-stopping second, my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It was framed by a wild mane of dark hair, but the face itself was more leathery than furred. It had a heavy brow ridge, a wide, flat nose, and a mouth that was a thin, tight line. But the eyes held me captive. Set deep under that heavy brow, they were not the simple, reflective discs of a nocturnal animal. They were dark, almost black, and they held a shocking, terrifying depth of awareness. They were not wild with aggression or predatory hunger. They were wide with pain, and with a fear so profound, it felt like an echo of my own. My finger was on the trigger, the cold metal a point of absolute certainty in a world that had just dissolved into madness. My mind, the primitive, terrified part of my brain that had kept my ancestors alive, was screaming at me. Threat. Unknown. Kill it. It was a simple, brutal command. The rifle was an extension of my will, and my will was to survive. But I could not shoot. I could not pull the trigger, because those eyes were not the eyes of a monster. They were the eyes of a thinking, feeling being that knew it was trapped, wounded, and at my mercy. In that frozen moment, I saw the reason for its clumsiness, for its desperate breaking and entering. Its left leg was horribly injured. The flashlight beam moved down its body, and I saw the gash. It was a deep, ragged tear that ran from just below its knee almost to its ankle, the flesh ripped open as if it had been snagged on a shard of rock or a broken tree limb. The fur around the wound was matted into stiff, dark clumps with dried blood, and the exposed muscle tissue was a raw, angry red. It looked like it had fallen, perhaps down a steep, rocky embankment, and the injury was severe, life-threatening. It made no move toward me, no threatening sound. It simply watched me, its chest rising and falling in shallow, pained breaths, each exhalation a cloud of steam in the cold air. It was waiting for my judgment. The entire forest, the entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what I would do. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in my hands. Slowly, my arms trembling with a mixture of fear and a strange, burgeoning empathy, I lowered the barrel of the gun. The movement was a colossal effort of will, a fight against every instinct screaming at me to eliminate the threat. The tip of the rifle pointed down at the dirt floor. The creature's posture relaxed, and a barely perceptible easing of the tension in its massive shoulders. It was a minute shift, but it was unmistakable. It had understood the gesture. It knew I had chosen not to kill it. I began to back away, and my boots scuffing softly on the concrete. I never took my eyes off it, and moving with a slow, deliberate caution. My hand fumbled behind me for the doorknob. My fingers found the cold brass, and I pulled the door open, slipped through the opening, and closed it softly behind me. I leaned against the wood, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My mind was a whirlwind of impossibility and stark reality. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. The myths were real, and one was bleeding in my greenhouse. But my body, strangely, moved on instinct, an instinct that bypassed the chaos in my head. It was not the instinct to fight or flee, but something else entirely. Something I had not felt in a long, long time. I went to the kitchen. The pot of venison stew from the night before was still on the stove. I lit the burner and warmed it, the familiar, savory smell a bizarrely normal counterpoint to the impossible situation. I ladled the thick, hot stew into my largest ceramic bowl, filling it to the brim. Then I took the large metal bucket I used for carrying water from the well and filled it with fresh, cold water. My hands were shaking as I carried my offerings back to the connecting door. I lifted the bar, my breath catching in my throat. What was I doing? Was I insane? This creature had broken into my home. It was powerful enough to tear me apart, and I was about to feed it. I opened the door just enough to slide the heavy bowl and the bucket inside, pushing them across the threshold into the greenhouse. I did not look in. I did not want to see it again just yet, afraid that a second look would break the strange spell of compassion and bring the fear roaring back. I closed the door quickly, latched it, and dropped the heavy iron bar back into place. Then I retreated to my kitchen table, sat down in the dark, and waited, listening to the silence, which now felt heavier, more expectant than ever before. For what felt like an hour, there was nothing, just the whisper of the wind outside and the frantic beating of my own heart. I began to think I had made a terrible mistake. And then I heard it. A soft, hesitant sound from beyond the door. The faint, unmistakable scrape of the ceramic bowl on the concrete floor. For 2 days, that was our routine. A silent, strange dance of provision and acceptance. Each morning at dawn, and again at dusk, I would carry out the heavy bowl of stew or leftover meat and the full bucket of water. I'd unbar the connecting door, my heart a steady, heavy thud in my chest, and place the offerings just inside the threshold of the greenhouse. I never lingered. I would close the door, bar it, and retreat into the main cabin, my ears straining for any sound. Sometimes, after a long silence, I would hear the soft scrape of the ceramic bowl on the concrete or the gentle lapping of water. I never saw it eat. It would only take the food after I was gone, a clear and deliberate boundary that I dared not cross. It was a truce of sorts, an agreement to occupy the same small corner of the world without direct confrontation. But with each passing day, a new kind of dread began to settle over me. The wounds on its leg were not getting better. Through a small, grimy pane of glass in the connecting door, I could watch it for brief periods. It spent most of its time lying in the corner, a mound of dark fur and quiet suffering. The gash, from what I could see, was becoming a festering disaster. The flesh around the edges was an angry, swollen red, and the fur was matted with more than just dried blood now. A sickly sweet, foul odor began to seep under the door, a smell I knew from my years in the woods, the smell of infection, of flesh beginning to die. It was moving less, and when it did shift its weight, a low, guttural grunt of pain would escape its chest, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the cabin. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that without help, it would likely die. It would die right there, 10 feet from my living space, a mythical creature succumbing to a mundane, earthly affliction. The thought was unbearable. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to leave it alone, to let nature run its brutal course. This was not my problem. This was a wild, unknown thing, a creature of immense power that could kill me with a single swipe of its arm. To approach it, to touch it, was to invite a violent death. And yet, I could not shake the memory of its eyes. That was not an animal I had seen. not just an animal. The awareness, the fear, the pain, it was all too familiar, too close to human. To stand by and do nothing felt like a profound moral failure, a betrayal of some unspoken law of compassion that transcended species. On the morning of the third day, the decision was made. I woke not with fear, but with a grim resolve. I gathered my first aid kit, a metal box filled with the essentials for a man living miles from any doctor. I put a large pot of water on the stove to boil, the steam clouding the cold windows. From a storage trunk, I pulled out the cleanest rags I owned, old cotton sheets torn into strips. My heart pounded with a fear so intense it was almost paralyzing, a cold, metallic taste in the back of my throat. But the memory of those intelligent, suffering eyes pushed me forward. I scrubbed my hands and forearms raw with soap and hot water, then laid out my meager surgical tools on the kitchen table. Antiseptic, gauze, medical tape, a pair of tweezers. Carrying the supplies in a metal basin, I walked to the greenhouse door. My hand hesitated on the iron bar. This was the precipice. Once I crossed it, there was no going back. I took a breath, lifted the bar, and opened the door. I entered the greenhouse, moving slowly, deliberately, keeping my hands in the basin of supplies visible. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth, spilled soil, and the foul odor of infection. The creature's massive head lifted, and those dark, intelligent eyes locked onto mine. Every muscle in its body went rigid, a coiled spring of immense power. It raised itself slightly on its forearms, a low rumble starting deep in its chest. This was it. The moment of truth. I stopped, 10 feet away from it, and set the supplies down on the concrete floor. I did not speak, not at first. I simply held up my empty hands, palms forward, a universal gesture of peace. Then I pointed from the basin of supplies to its wounded leg. I did it again, a slow, deliberate pantomime of intent. I began to speak, my voice low and calm, a steady murmur that I hoped conveyed reassurance rather than threat. The words themselves were meaningless, just rambling thoughts about the weather, the trees, anything to fill the tense silence with a non-aggressive sound. It watched me for a long minute, its dark eyes never leaving my face, searching for something, a sign of deceit or aggression. The rumbling in its chest subsided, but its body remained taut with suspicion. And then it did something that defied all logic, all instinct. It exhaled, a long, slow sigh that seemed to drain the tension from its frame. Slowly, deliberately, it shifted its weight, extending its injured leg slightly toward me, and lowered its massive body onto its side. It was an act of profound trust, a surrender so complete it left me breathless. For the next hour, I worked in a state of hyper-focused reality. My hands, which had been trembling, found a strange steadiness. I knelt beside the creature, so close I could feel the heat radiating from its body. The fur was coarse and thick, matted with dirt and blood. I carefully parted it around the wound. Up close, it was worse than I had imagined. The gash was deep, cutting through the thick hide and into the muscle beneath. The flesh was hot to the touch, weeping a yellowish fluid. I dipped a rag in the hot water and began to clean the area. The creature flinched, and a deep, shuddering grunt vibrated through the floor. But it did not pull away. It just lay there, its head resting on the concrete, its eyes closed, enduring the pain. I poured the antiseptic directly into the gash. Its entire body went rigid, and a sharp hiss of breath escaped its lips, but it never moved to stop me. With the tweezers, I pulled out splinters of wood and small bits of rock embedded deep in the tissue. I cleaned and flushed the wound as thoroughly as I could, the antiseptic stinging my own small cuts. Finally, I packed the gash with clean gauze and began to wrap the leg with the cotton strips, creating a crude but functional bandage. The limb was immense, the circumference of its calf wider than my thigh. When I was finished, I was drenched in sweat, my shirt clinging to my back. My muscles ached from the tension. I sat back on my heels, exhausted. The creature opened its eyes and looked at me. It laid its head down, its breathing evening out, slower and deeper than before. We had a compact, sealed not with words, but with shared vulnerability. The storm arrived with the fury of a vengeful god. It began not on the radio, but as a shift in the air, a strange, heavy stillness that fell over the forest on the 9th day. The sky turned a bruised, metallic gray, and the usual chatter of birds and squirrels fell silent. The creature felt it first. Its calm demeanor, which had grown over the days of my care, evaporated. It became restless, pacing the confines of the greenhouse, its massive form moving back and forth like a caged animal. It would stop at the broken pane of glass and stare out at the ridge line, a low, guttural sound of anxiety rumbling in its chest. Its unease was contagious, a primal warning that seeped through the walls and into my own bones. That evening, I turned on my old battery-powered weather radio. The crackling voice of the forecaster was grim, speaking of a major winter system coming down from Canada, a collision of Arctic air and Pacific moisture. They were calling it the worst storm of the season, perhaps of the last decade. They predicted 18 to 30 inches of snow, with winds gusting up to 60 miles per hour. The words they used were blizzard conditions and life-threatening. I started preparing immediately. The creature watched me through the connecting door as I worked, its dark eyes following my every move. I spent the rest of the day in a flurry of methodical activity, the only antidote I knew for the rising fear. I hauled load after load of firewood from the woodshed, stacking it high inside the cabin until the wall next to the stove was a solid bulwark of split pine and fir. I checked the fuel in my small generator, filled extra canisters with gasoline, and filled every spare container I had with water from the well pump, knowing the power would be the first thing to go. I secured the shutters on the windows and checked the roof for any loose shingles, my fingers growing numb in the rapidly dropping temperature. By nightfall, the temperature had plummeted from a mild 30 degrees to 15 in just a few hours. The first flakes of snow began to fall around sunset. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a picturesque winter evening, but hard, stinging pellets that came down at an angle, driven by an increasingly strong wind. Before I barred the doors for the night, I brought the creature an extra portion of food and a second bucket of water, not knowing when I would be able to safely reach the greenhouse again. It was pacing more actively now, its anxiety a palpable force in the small space. The wind picked up through the night, and by morning of the 10th day, the storm was raging in earnest. It was no longer a storm. It was a living thing, a malevolent entity trying to tear my world apart. The wind howled like a banshee, a physical force that shook the entire cabin, whistling and screaming through every tiny gap in the walls. Snow was falling so thick I could not see 20 feet in any direction. It was a total whiteout, a swirling vortex of horizontal snow driven by winds that had to be hitting 50 miles per hour or more. I could barely push the cabin door open against the wind and the accumulated drift, which was already 2 feet deep. The temperature, according to the old thermometer outside the kitchen window, now read 8 degrees, and that was before factoring in the brutal wind chill. This was dangerous weather, the kind that could kill a man in minutes if he were caught outside. Around midday, I heard a loud groaning sound from above, a noise that carried even over the constant roar of the wind. It was the sound of wood under an immense strain. My stomach dropped. The cabin was old, built by my own hands over 2 summers. It was solid, but I had never designed it to withstand this kind of load. The wet, heavy snow was accumulating on the roof at an alarming rate, a weight of thousands of pounds pressing down on the structure. Then came a sharp, sickening crack that sounded like a gunshot inside the small space. A long, splintering fissure appeared in the main ceiling beam, the thick, hand-hewn log that was the spine of the entire cabin. Dust and slivers of wood rained down on the floor. The cabin, my only sanctuary, was failing. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. At that same moment, a tremendous crash came from the back of the cabin, followed by the sound of shattering glass and a rush of wind and snow. A section of the greenhouse roof, unable to bear the weight of a massive drift, had collapsed. A cascade of snow, glass, and splintered wood poured into the structure. Through the connecting door, I saw the creature roar, a sound of fury and fear as it scrambled away from the collapsing section. The storm was inside with it now. The wind tore through the broken roof, and snow began to fill the small space. It was trapped, its shelter compromised. Before I could even process what to do next, the connecting door shuddered in its frame. Then it splintered. The creature, driven by instinct and the immediate danger, forced its way through. The wood of the door jamb cracked and gave way as its massive shoulder pushed through, and it stumbled into the main cabin. It was inside my space now, a giant, wild thing filling the small room, bringing the scent of pine, wet fur, and ozone with it. It looked at the cracking beam above, its intelligent eyes wide with what I could only interpret as the same terror that gripped me. There was no time for fear of each other. We were 2 beings trapped in a collapsing box, and the storm was our common enemy. I pointed a trembling finger at the thick ironwood logs I kept stacked by the hearth for emergency repairs. Logs too heavy for me to lift alone. It understood immediately. While I scrambled to get a heavy-duty jack and a toolbox from under my bed, it simply walked to the center of the room, braced its massive shoulders under the sagging, cracking beam, and with a deep grunt that was all effort, took the weight. The muscles in its back and legs bunched and strained under its thick hide, and the groaning of the beam lessened. It held. For the next 6 hours, we worked in the screaming chaos of the storm, a silent, desperate team. The world shrank to the small, lamp-lit space of the cabin, the howl of the wind, our constant companion. We communicated with grunts and gestures, an intuitive understanding born of shared crisis. I would position a support post, and it would adjust its stance, allowing the weight to transfer, never letting the main beam slip. It would reach over with one massive arm, and grip an ironwood log that I could barely roll and lift it as if it were a fallen branch, holding it steady against the ceiling while I frantically hammered braces and supports into place. It seemed to possess an innate understanding of structural engineering, of stress points and load distribution. More than once, it would nudge a support I was placing with its huge hand, shifting it a few inches to a better, more stable position. It was always right. My hands grew numb, then clumsy with cold. My back and shoulders burned with an agony of effort. But we kept working, fueled by adrenaline and the primal will to survive. Slowly, brace by brace, support by support, we stabilized the structure. The roof still sagged, but the cracking had stopped. The immediate danger had passed. When the last support was nailed into place, I collapsed against the wall, my body shaking with cold and exertion, my lungs aching. The creature, its own body steaming in the cold air, breathing in deep, ragged gasps, slowly eased its weight off the beam and settled onto the floor nearby. The storm continued to rage through the night, but inside our small, battered fortress, a new quiet had fallen. We had saved the cabin. Together, I brought out my spare blankets, all I had, and laid them on the floor. We huddled in the dim light of a single lantern, two survivors listening to the fury of the world outside, sharing a space that had become a sanctuary for us both. The world after the storm was silent, white, and clean. The fury had exhausted itself, leaving behind a profound stillness that was almost unnerving. The sun, a stranger for 2 days, emerged weak and pale, casting a brilliant, blinding glare across a landscape that had been completely remade. Every sharp edge of the mountains was softened, every tree branch laden with a heavy coat of white. We spent the better part of the next 3 days digging ourselves out. We worked together in that same easy, unspoken rhythm we had found while saving the cabin. I would use the snow shovel, clearing a path from the door, and the creature would follow, using its massive scoop-like hands to move volumes of snow I could not have shifted in an hour. Its wounds, I noticed as we worked, were healing at a remarkable rate. The crude bandage I had applied was long gone, but the gash on its leg had closed over, leaving a raw, pink scar that was quickly being covered by new fur. It moved with a new strength, a fluid power that had been absent before. The pained, hesitant limp was almost gone, replaced by a confident, ground-covering stride. A deep, bittersweet knowledge settled in my gut. I had succeeded. I had helped it heal. And now, it would leave. Our time was coming to an end. The wild was calling it home. The restlessness returned, but it was different now. It was not the anxious pacing of a trapped animal, but the quiet, expectant energy of a traveler preparing for a journey. It would spend hours just outside the cabin, standing at the edge of the tree line, its massive head tilted as if listening to a conversation carried on the wind. It was reacquainting itself with its own world, a world I could never be a part of. On the 16th day after it first arrived, I woke to find it standing by the cabin door, not looking in, but out at the forest. The morning was cold and still, the air so crisp it hurt to breathe. It had not made a sound, but I knew it was waiting for me. I pulled on my boots and coat and went outside. It turned and looked at me, a long, deep gaze that I could not decipher,
but felt in the marrow of my bones.
It was a look that contained everything we had shared. The initial fear, and the pain, and the trust, and the shared terror of the storm, and the quiet companionship. It was gratitude, and a farewell, and something more, a profound, ancient sadness. It raised one huge, scarred hand, the one that had held the ceiling beam in place, and held it out, palm up. The gesture was slow, deliberate, giving me every chance to refuse. I hesitated for only a second before stepping forward and placing my own hand in its palm. The touch was gentle, the skin calloused and warm despite the cold. Its fingers, thick as branches, curled slightly, not to grip, but to simply hold. In that contact, the vast gulf between our worlds seemed to vanish. We were just two living things, sharing a moment of quiet understanding under the vast, silent sky. Then, it released my hand. It turned and walked out the door. It moved across the deep snow with an impossible grace, a dark giant against the brilliant white, its powerful legs carrying it effortlessly toward the trees. At the edge of the forest, it paused for a single, fleeting moment, but it did not look back. And then it was gone, swallowed by the pines without a sound, as if it had been a dream all along. The cabin felt cavernous in its absence. The loneliness I had come here to embrace now felt like a wound, a hollow ache in my chest. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was empty. Weeks passed. The sun gained strength, and the great white world began to recede. The snow melted, first in patches, then in torrents, swelling the creek in the valley below. The first green shoots of spring pushed through the damp earth, and the birds returned, their songs filling the air. I repaired the greenhouse and reinforced the cabin roof, my hands moving with a familiar purpose, and slowly, a new kind of peace settled over me. I found that I was not truly alone. The forest no longer felt menacing, but full. I knew it was out there. Sometimes, at dusk, when the light was soft and the air was still, I would hear a deep, resonant call echo through the valley. A sound that was not an owl or a coyote, a sound that was both a hoot and a roar. And I would smile. There was a greeting, a reassurance, an echo in the wilderness that told me I was not alone. Then one morning, in late April, a different sound came. A sound that did not belong. The mechanical, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a helicopter. It was a violent intrusion, a tearing of the quiet fabric of my world. It flew low over my cabin, the downdraft whipping the new leaves on the trees into a frenzy. It circled once, then headed for the high ridge to the north. I grabbed my binoculars, my hands suddenly cold and trembling. I focused them on the machine as it hovered above a dense stand of old-growth fir. I saw men in dark, tactical gear rappelling down ropes, disappearing into the trees like invasive insects. My heart seized in my chest, a cold, hard knot of dread. I ran outside, helpless, staring at the distant machine, a silent scream trapped in my throat. A few minutes later, the sounds began. Faint at first, then clearer. Shouting. Human voices, sharp and aggressive, echoing unnaturally in the vastness. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold. A sharp, distinct a dart rifle. A moment of silence. And then a single, deafening crack of a real gun, a high-powered rifle, a sound that ripped through the morning and shattered the peace forever. The shouting stopped. The forest fell silent, a silence that was heavy, final. After what felt like an eternity, the helicopter began to lift. A large, dark shape, bundled and inert in a cargo net, was winched up from the trees. Even through the binoculars, I could see the matted brown fur, the impossible size of the form. It swung limply beneath the helicopter's belly like a trophy. The machine turned and flew east toward the cities and the noise until it was just a speck against the blue sky. The forest fell silent again. But this time, the silence was absolute. It was the silence of a void, the silence of a world that had been robbed of its last mystery. The echo was gone.